Well, today we are talking about A Course in Miracles perspective on Jesus and the Disinherited. Jesus and the Disinherited is a book written by Howard Thurman that was published in 1949 and went on to become a real blueprint and spiritual foundation for the American civil rights movement of the 1960s and beyond. I discovered it and read it last year when I was part of a peacemaking and anti-racism group that was hosted by an organization called Global Immersion. It wasn't part of our formal curriculum, but Oshita Moore and a few of us got together last summer and formed a book club around it. And I found Thurman's writing so compelling that for a while now, I've been wanting to share it with you and to talk about some of the parallels between Jesus and the Disinherited and A Course in Miracles that are particularly striking. First, though, I just want to zoom out and say that if you are new to the Circle community, as Robert mentioned in the introduction, I do like to dedicate a Sunday gathering in January to commemorating Martin Luther King Day. And the reason for that is because the American civil rights movement and King both, I think, should be very close to our hearts as course students, as an example of Jesus's love ethic in action in a way that actually worked to change the world. So often as course students and teachers, and I can tell you this firsthand, it's difficult to stand up for the ideals of divine love and forgiveness in a world that sees them as weak and naive. It's difficult sometimes to stand up for these ideas in a world that sees strength as fighting back and ever more outrage. And so when Martin Luther King comes along and says that the aim is not to defeat or humiliate, but to win friendship and understanding, sometimes we forget that he was called weak and naive for that view. Sometimes we forget that he was called a traitor to his race and ineffective to his cause until the civil rights movement gained enough success to demonstrate that activism rooted in higher principles could not only bring forth real political change, but with it, a more just and compassionate society. As course students, one of my deepest hopes is that we can be inspired by examples like King to hold the line of spiritual values and ideals that we believe in, which in our case and in King's case is the ideals and the values of Jesus. Here at the Circle, we love to talk about the through line that goes from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, to Tolstoy, whose writings on nonviolence inspired Gandhi, to Martin Luther King, and so on. Those of you who've been here for a while have heard us talk about that through line quite a bit. But there's someone else in that chain that you should know. And as I'm sure you can guess by our theme today, that is Howard Thurman. As I've come to learn, you can't truly honor the work and the legacy of Martin Luther King without understanding the very pivotal role that Thurman played, not only in connecting King to the philosophy of Gandhi, but in profoundly shaping King as a leader, as a follower of Jesus, and as a result, profoundly shaping the civil rights movement more broadly. Jesus and the Disinherited is a very thin book. It's not very many pages. And so it's easy to believe those close to King who said that he not only traveled with it, but he actually carried it on his person during the time of the Montgomery bus boycotts and sit-ins and freedom rides and so on. Again, as course students, we should know about these writings and we should be very aware of this history. So, quick background on Thurman. He was born poor in Florida during the time of the segregated South. And so he and his family experienced firsthand a lot of the dehumanization and systematic oppression of the time. After graduating as valedictorian of his high school, he became a Baptist minister and he went on to hold a lot of prominent positions. He has a really fascinating, very storied life. You should look him up. But what's most interesting about his history for our purposes today is that his real moral foundation appeared to come from his grandmother. Thurman talks in his book about how his grandmother was a slave, and she would tell him stories about the brutal life that she experienced and witnessed on the plantation. She talked about the backbreaking work. She talked about the constant threat of punishment. She talked about how agonizing it was to watch as families were ripped apart. And she also told him that the preacher on the plantation would frequently quote lines from the Bible, like, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters," to make the whole system appear to be divinely justified. And yet, despite that, Thurman's grandmother remained deeply religious. Her faith was never shaken, in part because she held on to the liberation stories of the Bible, stories like Moses leading the Israelites out of bondage. And she held on to those stories. She clung to those stories as her source of hope and her source of resilience. And it was Thurman's grandmother who passed on to him that it's possible to maintain a sense of dignity even under the harshest of conditions. He said that she's the one who told him that no matter what, and this is a quote from her, "you must never let someone make you feel like you're nobody." So fast forward a few decades to when Gandhi led the nonviolent protests to kick the British out of India. And Thurman took notice of that because that philosophy of civil disobedience, what Gandhi called satyagraha, or confronting injustice while maintaining moral and spiritual integrity, that's exactly what he had learned from his grandmother. So in 1936, 6 years after Gandhi led the salt marches for Indian independence, Thurman went to India on a pilgrimage and he met Gandhi in person. And while they were together, Gandhi and Thurman talked personally about nonviolence as a political strategy, but they also talked about it as a spiritual way of life that requires an immense inner transformation and immense personal discipline. And famously, Gandhi told Thurman that he hoped African Americans could adopt the philosophy and the tools of nonviolent resistance in the struggle against racism in the States. And so when Thurman came back to America, he started lecturing. He started preaching about Gandhi and satyagraha. And that's when Martin Luther King really started to become influenced by these ideals. A lot of people know about Martin Luther King's pilgrimage to India in 1959 to study Gandhi's methods. King didn't get to meet Gandhi, of course, because Gandhi had been assassinated just over 10 years earlier. But what a lot of people don't know about that trip that King made to India is that he might not have even gone to India in the first place if he weren't inspired by Thurman's writings and Thurman's own pilgrimage to India over 20 years before. There are many links on that chain between the essence of Jesus's teachings on love and nonviolence. But again, there's a very straight line from Jesus to Tolstoy, to Gandhi, to Thurman, to King, and so on. And so now that you have a bit more context for why all of this is so important to us as course students, I want to move into the central topic of our gathering today, which is Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, and its connection to A Course in Miracles. As I mentioned earlier, Jesus and the Disinherited was published in 1949. And what has made this book so significant is that it takes the struggles of marginalized and oppressed people and offers a spiritual response that is grounded in the teachings of Jesus. And there's three main ways that Thurman does this. So I'm just going to start very big picture and tell you what they are, and then I'll go through each of them individually. So essentially in the book, Thurman makes the case that, number one, Jesus as a Jew under Roman occupation is oppressed. And so he knows firsthand the struggles and the humiliations that go with it. So Jesus himself is in solidarity with the disinherited. Number two, Thurman says that being oppressed creates an inner world of darkness, an inner world that is driven by fear, deception, and hate. And Jesus can liberate through his teachings on the opposite. So in other words, we can transcend that inner world of fear, deception, and hate if we choose Jesus's message of faith, integrity, and love. And that is how we reclaim our dignity. And number three, Thurman says that when you reclaim your dignity, that becomes the foundation from which you can go out into the world as the ultimate example of Jesus's teachings to love your enemy. So you can heal the world as he did, because now you can transform oppressors with love instead of hate, which is the ultimate form of nonviolent resistance, because it doesn't perpetuate the very violence that it seeks to overturn. So it's a nice cycle, right? But it all starts with seeing Jesus as an outcast who is excluded from any form of societal power. And that's just not how we're accustomed to thinking about him. We're used to seeing Jesus as the exact opposite. We're used to thinking about Jesus as the most powerful person in human history. You walk into any church around the world, and there he is on the windows, glowing and full of authority. That's not exactly oppressed. But Thurman's point is that Jesus, in his life as an impoverished Jew under Roman rule, experienced firsthand what it's like to be disenfranchised, and certainly from his crucifixion, experienced firsthand what it's like to be humiliated. And that makes Jesus uniquely relevant to those who, as Thurman said, have their backs against the wall. And it's a really interesting reframe where Jesus isn't this distant king, but a member of the oppressed whose teachings are for the oppressed. And so what that means is Jesus now becomes a figure of liberation. Now he's a lifeline for the masses that society has forced into submission. And now Christian faith has something meaningful to say to those with their backs against the wall. And rather than the Bible being used as a weapon of suppression to keep suppression in place, as it was with Thurman's grandmother, where the plantation preachers were quoting scripture to justify slavery, now in the form of Jesus's teachings, the Bible becomes a call to social justice. But this is Jesus, right? So it's not justice in the form of domination. It's justice in the form of liberation that comes from inner transformation. And that's Thurman's second point. If you go back to what scholars believe are Jesus's original teachings, meaning wisdom that scholars believe actually came from Jesus himself, what you discover is that Jesus isn't interested in being glorified. And he's not interested in our external achievements, and he's not interested in our rituals. What he's interested in is our inner changes of love and forgiveness, because it's those inner changes where we are able to live a life that is righteous. It's from those inner changes where we're able to live a life that is in alignment with God's will. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Love your enemies. Do good to those who want to harm you. Pray for those who persecute you, etc. And so Thurman's point in his book is that when people are oppressed, what happens is this dark interior world begins to form. And this dark interior world is rooted in fear, deception, and hate. And we need Jesus's transformational teachings to pull us out of that place. And just to say a little bit more about that dark interior world that develops when we feel marginalized and excluded, Thurman says that it starts with fear of violence, fear of deprivation, fear of persecution, fear of our loved ones being harmed, etc. And Thurman said, quote, "Fear is one of the persistent hounds of hell that dog the footsteps of the poor, the dispossessed, and the disinherited." So when you're in fear, what happens, he said, is that the next thing, deceit, becomes a way to survive. Now, deceit is a heavy word. It's hard for us to take in, especially in a spiritual context. I remember talking to Oshita about this idea specifically. So I want to unpack my understanding of what Thurman means by deceit a little bit. Because when we think of deceit, we think of lying, don't we? And that's accurate. If you look up deceit in the dictionary, it means, quote, concealing or misrepresenting the truth. And this feels like the opposite of what it is to be spiritual until you realize that Thurman's point is that when you are forced to outwardly conform to a system that you despise internally, that is deceit. When you have to conceal the truth of how wrongly you're being treated for the sake of your own self-preservation, that is deceit. When you are forced to pretend, what Thurman called, quote, fostering a false self to navigate oppressive structures, that is deceit. So it's deceit in the sense that you're concealing or misrepresenting the truth, but the deception comes because out of fear, you are literally forced to hide or lie about how you really feel. And that's corrosive enough to the self that what happens is before long, you move into hate. You start hating the people who are doing this to you. So fear leads to deceit, where you have to compromise your integrity just to get by. And that deceit leads to hate. Thurman said, quote, hatred is born out of great suffering, out of the need for revenge and the desperate desire for justice. He goes on to say that the appeal of hate is that it can seem like a way to reclaim your humanity. It can seem like a way to rebalance that scale of power. But all hate really does in the end is continue that cycle of violence and suffering. And this, of course, is where Jesus comes in. Because as Thurman points out, if the inner life of the oppressed is shaped by fear, deception, and hate, well, that's the very thing that Jesus came to heal. If Jesus is a liberator, then the way he liberates is, again, through dissolving inner darkness with light. Where there's fear, we show faith. Where there's deceit, we show truth. Where there's hate, we show love. And that's soul force. Love becomes the spiritual force that breaks the chain of hatred and oppression. In Jesus and the Disinherited, Thurman wrote, "Only through love can the oppressed achieve the inner strength to rise above their condition and transform the world." And that's the final point of the book, because Jesus counters fear with faith in God's love and the assurance of divine care. By trusting in God, we can do the same. By trusting in God and being the embodiment of God's divine love in the world, we can transcend our fear, we can reclaim our dignity, and we can heal the world by transforming enemies into friends. And what does all of that sound like to you? If I never mentioned Thurman's name, but said, I have a book for you that is interested in giving you a new vision of Jesus. If I said, I have a book for you that is profoundly interested in transforming our inner world of attack and fear into one of forgiveness and love, if I said I had a book for you that is calling us to see God-given holiness, equality, and worth in all beings without exception, and from that lofty place we'll be more inspired to love them, and loving them is what is ultimately going to heal our world, you would probably think I'm talking about A Course in Miracles. If I told you that you don't have to side with others' misperceptions of you, if I told you that you can be free in the understanding that we have invisible divine reality given to us by God that transcends any and all of the harsh conditions that we face in this world, that invisible divine reality transcends whether we are the oppressor or the oppressed, again, you would probably think I'm talking about A Course in Miracles. And I am. And so it's interesting to note that the Course is leading us to that same finish line that it shares with all of the great and far too few nonviolent movements of history. This is love that is not passive. This is love that is redemptive. The Course says, and if you remember nothing else about today, I do want you to remember this. The Course says we can know that love is more powerful than war because love is the thing that heals war. And so for the purposes of our topic for today, love is what demonstrates that you can confront evil without perpetuating harm. And in the end, the only thing that hate can do, as Thurman wrote in Jesus and the Disinherited, is, quote, destroy the core of the life of the hater. I sincerely hope that Jesus and the Disinherited will continue to inspire general readers and activists and pastors and course students seeking that deeper understanding of how faith can meaningfully address the suffering of the world. And I also hope that you can see the connection here, because as students of A Course in Miracles, we know that this path has endless and truly beautiful gifts for our minds. And we've just barely started to discover those gifts. The Course teaches us to see things and to think about things in a way that is so different and so pure and so loving that they seem just not of this world. The Course asks us to think in a way that feels like a shaft of heaven come to earth. And when the Course asks us to be about the business of bringing our minds into alignment with these incredible teachings, that's what it's talking about. We are asked to pursue those shifts in perceptions that move our mind from fear to love. We are asked to attain a truly beautiful mind. We are asked to attain in the Course a mind that is actually holy. And it's not holy because it's better than, it's holy because it becomes a mind that can only bless. The Course is not asking us to merely step back and change our mind about the world. There is a step forward to make. It's from a mind that has been transformed from fear and deceit and hate to faith, integrity, and love that we can give an emphatic yes to God's voice, which the Course says asks one question of us and one question only. And that question is, are you ready yet to help me save the world? The Course says, ask this instead of what the ego is, and you will see a sudden brightness cover up the world the ego has made. No miracle is now withheld from anyone. The world is saved from what you thought it was. And what it is wholly uncondemned and wholly pure. That is the example held out to us by the wisdom of Howard Thurman. That is the example so powerfully demonstrated by Gandhi and by Martin Luther King. And above all, that is the example shown to us by Jesus himself. If we fully allow the Course's gifts into our mind, we can change the world. Because then we can demonstrate, as they did, that love is not just a good feeling. Love is an unstoppable force. If the world is to truly heal, it is the only logical step. In the 50 years of the Course's history, this is what we have really failed to give our full attention to. And it's time that we finally face that. And it's time that we fully give ourselves to what the Course is asking us to do. At one point, the Course asks us if we would have our mind, quote, transformed into a radiant message of God's love to share with all the lonely ones who have denied him with you. And that's a two-part question. Do we want our mind transformed into a radiant message of God's love? And assuming that the answer is yes, what can we do to share that radiant message of love with all the lonely ones of which you are a part? And when you can do that, then that chain we keep talking about will go from Jesus to Tolstoy, to Gandhi, to Thurman, to King, to you, and to those that you inspire to choose love over fear and welcome into beloved community in the true liberation of our world. Thank you.